Widow finds a pregnant young woman passed out on a dirt road, but what she discovers next is shocking. Comment down below telling me what you thought of this story, giving it a rating from 0 to 10, and let me know what city you're watching from. I really want to know if you liked my story, and I want to get to know you better. So subscribe to my channel to support my work. I'm counting on your help. I was sure I had closed the gate. I was sure because I did it every night for the past 2 years, ever since Arthur passed away and left me alone on this homestead in the middle of nowhere. Closing the gate had become a ritual, almost a silent prayer before bed. But in the early hours of that winter morning, when I was coming back from town after delivering vegetables to the farmer's market, the gate was open, swinging slowly in the cold wind coming down from the ridge. I slowed down the old truck, that Chevy that Arthur rebuilt with his own hands, and that now creaks on every curve as if complaining about my company. The fog was so thick I could barely see the red dirt road ahead of me. It felt like the world had been swallowed by a cold white blanket, and all that was left was me, the rumble of the engine, and the chill creeping in through the cracked window. That's when I heard it. A groan. No, almost a sigh. Coming from the side of the road. I slammed on the brakes. My heart raced. I thought of a wounded animal. I thought of the wind rattling an old fence. I thought of just driving on and pretending I hadn't heard a thing. Because that's what you learn when you live alone out in the country. Mind your own business. But the groan came again. Weaker this time. And something inside me, something I thought had died along with Arthur, pushed me out of the truck. I stepped out, the cold bit into my skin. The fog was so dense, I had to turn on my phone's flashlight to see 2 steps ahead. I walked slowly toward the drainage ditch that runs alongside the road, the one that fills with mud when it rains. And that's where I saw her, a young woman, pregnant, lying on her side, her swollen belly pressed against the damp earth. She was wearing only a thin, torn shirt and pants caked in mud. Her feet were bare, battered with cuts that were still slowly bleeding. Her dark hair was plastered to her face. Her eyes were closed, breathing, but barely. I stood frozen for a second that felt like a lifetime. Every voice in my head screamed at me to get back in the truck, to call someone, the cops, anyone who wasn't me. Because I am a coward. I always have been. Arthur used to laugh about it, saying I was scared of my own shadow. And he was right. After he was gone, the fear only grew. I locked doors, avoided strangers, shut myself inside my own life like someone hiding in a closet. But right there, in that freezing dawn, with the fog surrounding me and that fragile girl on the ground, the fear took a back seat. I knelt down, touching her face gently. Her skin was ice cold. I called out to her. Nothing. I shook her lightly. Nothing. Then I pressed 2 fingers to her neck, searching for a pulse. It was there. Faint, but there. I didn't think. I just acted. I gathered the young woman in my arms. She was far too light for someone so many months pregnant, and carried her to the truck. I opened the back door, laid her across the seat as carefully as I could, and covered her with the old blanket I always keep there for emergencies. I sprinted back to the driver's seat, cranked the heater on high, and drove home faster than I should have on a road with 0 visibility. My mind was racing. Who was she? What had happened? Why was she out there all alone, no shoes, nothing in the dead of night? And why, out of all the roads in the world, had she ended up on mine? I got home, turned on every light in the house, carried the girl inside, and laid her on the bed in the guest room, the one nobody had used since my sister came to visit over a year ago. I ran to the kitchen cabinet and grabbed the first aid kit I'd put together years ago, back when I still worked as a labor and delivery nurse up in Chicago. A kit way too big for someone living alone in the country, but one I could never bring myself to throw away, as if some part of me knew that one day I'd need it. I examined her carefully, checked her pulse, her breathing, her temperature. I slowly lifted her shirt and traced her belly with my fingertips, feeling the baby moving inside, still alive. Thank God. I cleaned the wounds on her feet, applied antiseptic and wrapped them in gauze. I noticed the marks on her wrists. They weren't cuts, but deep purple bruises, like someone had held her down by force for way too long. I stayed awake beside her all night, sitting in an old chair, gripping a cup of cold coffee, staring at that stranger's face and wondering what on earth I had just done. Because bringing a stranger into my home, not knowing who she was, without telling a soul, without calling the authorities, that wasn't something I did. I was the quiet widow, the one who stayed under the radar, the one who stayed out of trouble. But here I was, in knee deep. The girl woke up as the sun started to brighten the sky outside, slowly burning off the fog. She opened her eyes slowly, looked at the ceiling, at the walls, at me, and then panic set in. She tried to jump out of bed, but her body wouldn't let her. She just kept staring at the window, as if expecting to see someone outside. She was breathing way too fast. "Easy now," I said, raising my hand slowly. "You're safe. I found you by the road. You needed help." She didn't answer, just kept staring at the window, trembling. "What's your name?" I asked, keeping my voice as soothing as possible. It took her a while. She swallowed hard, and when she finally spoke, her voice was so quiet I almost missed it. "Chloe. Chloe," I repeated, as if the name needed confirming. "How many months along are you?" 7. "What happened to you?" She looked away, pressed her lips together, and then she said something that made my stomach churn. "You shouldn't have brought me here, ma'am." I was speechless. She wasn't thanking me. She wasn't relieved. She was terrified. A terror that went far deeper than her broken body and battered feet. A terror that seemed to radiate from within, from something much bigger than that freezing night. "Why?" I asked, feeling my own voice shake for the first time. Chloe didn't answer. She just turned her face to the wall and closed her eyes, like she wanted to disappear. I quietly left the room and went to the kitchen. I grabbed the torn shirt I had taken off her the night before and tossed it into the hamper. Before throwing it in the wash, I checked the pockets on instinct, and that's when I found it. A note, small, folded up tight. A crumpled piece of paper with 3 words scribbled in shaky, barely readable handwriting. "He will return." I spent the next 3 days watching Chloe like you'd watch a spooked deer that might bolt at any second. She barely ate, spoke even less, and whenever she heard a noise outside, a twig snapping, the wind rattling the window panes, the neighbor's dog barking, her entire body tensed up. I tried to make conversation, but she gave me one-word answers. I tried asking about the baby, her family, anything at all, but she deflected with the kind of skill only someone carrying heavy secrets possesses. I didn't show her the note. I hid it in my dresser drawer, right next to the few things I had left of Arthur, his wedding band, a photo from our wedding day, a watch that stopped ticking a long time ago. I don't know why I hid it, maybe because showing it meant admitting I was tangled up in something I didn't understand. And I was already tangled up, whether I wanted to be or not. It was on the 4th day that Martha showed up. Martha was my closest neighbor, a 70-year-old woman who lived about a mile down the road and knew every family in the county, like she'd memorized their family trees. She knocked on the door with the confidence of someone who never needs an invitation, walked right in without waiting for an answer, and set a basket of fresh baked goods on the kitchen table. "Word around is you've got company," she said, looking down the hall toward the guest bedroom. I sighed. Of course she knew. Out here, news travels faster than a prairie wind. "Just a girl who needed some help," I replied, trying to play it cool. "Pregnant girl, I hear. No husband, no folks. She was sick on the side of the road. I brought her in to look after her." Martha gave me that look only seasoned old folks have. A look that can spot a lie from a mile away. Ruth, you know I'm not one to stick my nose where it doesn't belong. But if that girl is here, it's because something ain't right. And things that ain't right around these parts usually have a first and last name. I stayed quiet. She pulled out a chair, sat down, and crossed her arms on the table. Describe her to me. I did. Dark hair, brown eyes, maybe 22 years old, 7 months pregnant. Martha sat thinking for a minute, tapping her fingers like she was flipping through her mental filing cabinet. Could be the girl who stayed out at Clayton's ranch, she finally said. Out by Oakhaven, about 25 miles from here. Clayton. The name dropped into my kitchen like a heavy stone down a deep well. Who's this Clayton? I asked, my stomach tying itself in knots. Martha took a deep breath before answering. Piety man, landowner. Known for handling things his own way without needing anyone's permission. He's got friends in high places. The judge, the county commissioner, the sheriff. Nobody speaks a bad word about him in public, if you catch my drift. I caught it. I caught it perfectly. If that girl ran away from him, Martha continued, real careful. She left half an hour later, but she left a heavy tension in the air that didn't clear out even when I opened all the windows. I just stood in the kitchen, staring at the basket of bread she brought, turning over everything she'd said. Clayton, Oakhaven, powerful man, handles things his own way. That night, Chloe had a panic attack. I was in the living room, trying to read a book I couldn't focus on, when I heard a crash from her bedroom. I sprinted in and found her sitting on the bed, hugging her knees, hyperventilating, her wide eyes glued to the window. She was shaking so hard her teeth chattered. Chloe, what's wrong? I asked, approaching her slowly. He's coming, she whispered. I know he's coming. Go. She didn't answer, just kept staring out the window like she expected someone to emerge from the darkness. I sat on the bed next to her and took her hand in mine. It was freezing. I started talking calmly, using the same tone I used back at the hospital during those chaotic shifts when everything was falling apart, and you had to be the rock in the storm. Breathe with me. Slowly. Inhale. Hold it. Exhale. She tried. It took a while, but she tried. Gradually, her breathing started to slow down. The shaking eased up a bit. I kept holding her hand, feeling her pulse racing beneath her thin skin. Nobody is going to hurt you here, I said, I promise. Chloe looked at me for the first time with something that resembled trust. And then, without warning, she started to cry. It wasn't a desperate wail, it was the quiet sobbing of someone who had held it in for way too long and just couldn't anymore. I pulled her into a hug, feeling her whole body shake against mine, and I stayed right there until her tears ran dry. When she finally calmed down, she stared at her own hands for a long time before she spoke. He's the baby's father, she said, her voice raspy. But it wasn't out of love. It never was. The air caught in my throat. I didn't ask anything, I just waited. She went on, slowly, like she was pulling shards of glass out of her own throat. I saw things he did, things involving folks from around here, folks who trust him, documents, forged papers, land swindled out from under entire families. I kept the evidence, hid it. I was going to leave, but he found out before I could get away. And he left you out on that road, I finished the thought, feeling the anger rising in my chest. She nodded. He told me that if I opened my mouth, no one would believe a word I said, that I had prominent people on his payroll, judges, cops, politicians, said I was a nobody. I kept quiet, because she was right. In a small town where everyone knows everyone and power is hoarded by a few, the word of a man like Clayton was worth a lot more than the truth. But something inside me, maybe the same thing that made me pull over that cold morning, refused to accept it. Tomorrow, I'm going to the sheriff's station. I said, more to myself than to her. Chloe looked at me with a mix of fear and disbelief. It won't do any good. Maybe, but I have to try. The next day, I drove into town. The sheriff's station was a cramped, poorly painted cinder block building with 2 beat-up chairs in the waiting area and a ceiling fan that made more noise than breeze. The deputy at the front desk was a polite young guy who jotted down everything I said in a frayed notebook. He listened carefully, asked some questions, promised they would look into it. I walked out of there feeling exactly like I'd just spent 20 minutes talking to a brick wall. When I got back to the house, Chloe was sitting on the porch, staring out at the dirt road fading into the horizon. I sat down beside her without saying a word. We stayed like that for a while, in total silence, until she spoke up. "You're the first person who actually stayed." I looked at her, confused. "Everyone else bails when things get tough," she went on, "but you stayed." I didn't know what to say, so I just held her hand. And we sat there, 2 women beaten down by the world in different ways, sitting on a rickety porch in the middle of nowhere, holding on to each other because it was all we had left. The gate was open again. I was absolutely certain I had closed it the night before. I made a point to double-check before bed, because ever since I found Chloe, every little detail felt crucial. But when I woke up that morning and looked out the kitchen window, there it was, the gate swinging slowly in the breeze, wide open like an invitation. I walked out barefoot, still in my nightgown, and headed down the driveway. I looked both ways down the road. Nothing. No cars, no people, no sound besides the birds chirping and the wind rustling the trees. But in the mud, right by the gatepost, there were tracks. Tire tracks. Fresh ones. I marched back inside with my heart pounding in my throat. I didn't tell Chloe. I didn't want to terrify her any more than she already was. But I called Danny, my nephew, the only close relative I still really talked to. He drove a rig for an agricultural transport company in the next county over and knew every inch of this valley. "Aunt Ruth, you want me to swing by?" he asked, sounding worried. "No need to come just yet. Just keep an ear to the ground. If you hear any weird chatter, let me know." He promised he would. I hung up the phone and stood frozen in the kitchen, staring out the window, feeling for the first time since bringing Chloe home that maybe I had made a much bigger mistake than I realized. The next few days were incredibly tense. Chloe was withdrawing more and more, eating less, barely sleeping. I tried to stick to the routine, tending the garden, feeding the chickens, cooking meals, but everything felt completely pointless. It was like a dark cloud had settled over the house, and no matter how many windows I threw open, the light just wouldn't come in. It was Danny who delivered the bad news. He showed up unannounced on the afternoon of the 10th day, wearing a grim expression and speaking in a hushed tone. We sat out on the porch while Chloe was napping inside. "Aunt Ruth," I asked around, kept it real quiet. "Word is, there's a dark SUV that's been cruising around these parts. One guy inside, all alone. Parks up on the shoulder, just staring this way. Doesn't do anything. Just sits there." I felt the air leave my lungs. "Do you know who it is?" Couldn't get a good look at him, but the folks down at the diner said it's one of Clayton's guys. That name hung between us like a loaded gun. "He knows she's here," I whispered. Danny nodded gravely. "So what are you going to do?" I didn't know. For the first time in days, I truly had no idea. Later that same night, when Chloe was feeling a bit calmer, I finally got her to open up. We sat at the kitchen table, a hot cup of tea cupped in her hands, and piece by piece, she gave me the rest of the story. She explained that Clayton wasn't just a wealthy rancher. He was the guy who made deeds disappear, who forged contracts, who bullied whole families into signing away everything they owned. He'd been running this racket for years, and nobody ever touched him because he was protected. Big players, People who looked the other way when the price was right. I used to clean his house, Chloe said, staring into her tea like the words were floating at the bottom of the mug. Housekeeping, cooking, simple stuff. One day, I found a hidden folder in his study. I opened it. It was full of documents, fake land deeds, signatures that didn't match up, names of local families I actually knew, folks who lost the farm and never figured out how. And you kept the proof. I filled in the blank. She nodded. I snapped pictures of a bunch of files, hid them. I thought about taking them to someone, but I didn't know who to trust. I was planning to skip town before he realized they'd been touched, but he figured it out first. She paused, took a shaky breath, and kept going. He dumped me on that dirt road, told me that if I opened my mouth, nobody would believe a word I said, that I was just another piece of trash, that he's buried problems before, and nobody ever lifted a finger. My stomach tied itself in knots. Not just from the cruelty, I'd seen plenty of cruelty in my life, but from the sheer cold-bloodedness of it. His absolute certainty that he was untouchable. Where are the photos? I asked. On a flash drive. I stashed it at an acquaintance's place before I ran. She has no idea what's on it. I just told her to keep it safe. I sat in silence, processing the whole mess. Then I stood up, grabbed the phone, and called the only person I thought could actually help. Jessica, a lawyer who had moved to our town a few months back from Denver. I only knew her in passing, but I knew she had a reputation for being a straight shooter who wasn't afraid of a dirty fight. Jessica answered on the second ring. I laid out the situation without sugarcoating a thing. She listened silently, asked a few very specific questions, and then said, "I need to see this evidence. If it's exactly what you're telling us, I know." "Are you absolutely sure you want to stick your neck out for this?" I looked over at Chloe, sitting in my kitchen chair, hand resting on her belly, her eyes exhausted and her face way too gaunt for a pregnant woman. I thought about every single time I had let fear run my life. Fear of acting, fear of taking a risk, fear of just being noticed, and how all that fear had never actually protected me from a damn thing. "I'm sure," I replied. Jessica promised to come out first thing in the morning, but before she could get there, something happened that flipped everything upside down. Danny called me in the middle of the night. His voice was frantic. "Aunt Ruth, I just found out something bad. Travis, one of the guys on Clayton's payroll, is Brenda's cousin. You remember Brenda, right? Brenda, my childhood friend, someone I completely trusted. I remember. She casually mentioned to him that Chloe was staying out at your place. Didn't mean any harm by it, just making small talk, but he went straight to Clayton with it. It felt like the floorboards had just vanished beneath my feet. When? Yesterday." I hung up and just stood there in the dark living room, feeling the sting of betrayal, even if it was an accidental one, burning like a hot coal. It wasn't Brenda's fault. She couldn't have known. But the damage was done. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, staring out the window, waiting for headlights to come sweeping up the driveway. Nothing happened. But that creeping feeling that all hell was about to break loose wouldn't go away. The next day, Jessica arrived. She was a woman in her 40s, sharp haircut, piercing gaze, carrying herself like someone who doesn't waste time. We talked in the kitchen while Chloe rested. I ran through the whole story again. Jessica took notes, asked questions, chewed on the details. "If we can secure that flash drive, and it holds what you say it does, I can bypass local law enforcement and go straight to the state attorney's office, out of this county's jurisdiction, away from his good old boy network. And until then, you both need to watch your backs." She left late in the afternoon. Chloe and I were alone again. "You both need to watch your backs." She left late in the afternoon. Chloe and I were alone again, sitting out on the porch, staring at the empty dirt road, fully aware that uninvited company could show up at any second. "You didn't have to do all this," Chloe said softly. "I know." "Then why are you?" It took me a minute to answer, because the truth was messy, because I didn't fully understand it myself. But eventually, I found the words. Because somebody has to stay. She looked at me, and for the first time since I pulled her out of that ditch, I saw a glimmer of hope in her eyes. That night, I barely slept. And when I finally drifted off, I dreamt of open gates, fog swallowing up endless roads, and a hollow voice echoing that he would return. I woke up to the sound of footsteps on the porch. My heart spiked before my eyes even opened. I lay frozen in bed, holding my breath, straining to hear over the blood rushing in my ears. The footsteps stopped. Silence. Then, the distinct creak of old floorboards bowing under a weight that shouldn't be there. I slipped out of bed slowly, grabbed the heavy wooden broom handle I'd kept propped against the wall ever since the gate was left open the second time, and crept into the living room. I flipped the light switch. The porch was empty, but the front window, the one I was absolutely positive I had locked before turning in, was cracked open. I sprinted to Chloe's room. She was wide awake, sitting up in bed, clutching her stomach, her terrified eyes locked on the bedroom door. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. She nodded, shivering. I hurried back to the living room, locked every single window, dusting. Nobody. But sitting right on the kitchen table, where I knew for a fact there had been nothing when I went to sleep, was a note. Crumpled paper, bold handwriting, 2 words. Last chance. I collapsed into a kitchen chair, staring at the slip of paper with trembling hands. Chloe appeared in the doorway, pale as a ghost, leaning heavily against the doorframe. "He was in the house," she said, her voice cracking. "We don't know if it was him." "I know it was." I called Danny. He pulled up half an hour later with 2 of his buddies. They scoured the perimeter of the house. The driveway, the back pasture, nothing. Whoever had paid us a visit was long gone. But the message was loud and clear. Danny and his friends set up watch outside while I went back in. Chloe was slumped on the couch, hyperventilating, clutching her chest. I recognized the signs immediately, a full-blown panic attack. "Chloe, look at me," I said, dropping to my knees in front of her. "Breathe with me, nice and slow." She tried, but her body was betraying her. Sweat was pouring down her forehead. Her hands were ice cold. Her eyes were completely unfocused. I grabbed both her hands in mine and started counting out loud, using that firm, commanding voice from my hospital days when the ward was going to pieces. 1, 2, 3, breathe in. 4, 5, 6, let it out. It took a while, but she slowly started to come back to center. Her breathing leveled out, the shaking subsided, and then out and grabbed her belly. "What is it?" I asked, panic flaring in my chest. "It hurts," she gasped. "It hurts so bad." I helped her lie back on the sofa, gently lifted her shirt, and pressed my hands to her stomach. It was rock hard, contracted. I kept my hands there and waited. Another contraction and another, way too close together to be Braxton Hicks. "You're going into labor," I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. "It can't be now," she sobbed. "It's way too early." 7 months isn't too early. The baby has a fighting chance." I called 911. They answered on the 5th ring. I explained the situation. The dispatcher said they were dispatching a rig, but it was going to take a while because the fog had rolled back in thicker than ever, and the valley roads were treacherous. Half an hour, minimum. I hung up and looked at Chloe, writhing on my couch, her face slick with sweat and tears. We didn't have half an hour. I knew that in my bones. I'd spent enough years in the delivery room to know when a baby was done waiting. "Chloe, look right at me," I said, holding her face in my hands. "I have done this before, hundreds of times. I know exactly what I'm doing. You have to trust me." She nodded, squeezing my hand with unbelievable strength. I ran to the linen closet, grabbed clean sheets, towels, the medical kit, boiled water, sterile scissors. I set up a staging area in the living room, turning my old sofa into a makeshift delivery bed. I scrubbed my hands and arms in the sink until they were raw and red. I took a deep breath, and I went back to work. The next 2 hours were the longest of my entire life. Chloe screamed, cried, and crushed my hand until I thought the bones would snap. I talked to her non-stop, coaching her, calming her, letting muscle memory take over movements I hadn't practiced in years. My hands knew exactly what to do, even when my brain started to doubt. I checked her dilation, timed the contractions, wiped her forehead, kept telling her everything was going to be perfectly fine, even when I wasn't entirely sure myself. And then, right when the fog outside was so thick it felt like the house had been erased from the map, the baby came. A thin, piercing cry shattered the silence. I caught the baby in my hands, cleared the airway, checked the vitals. Tiny, but fierce. Alive. "It's a boy," I whispered, gently placing the screaming infant onto Chloe's chest. She stared down at her son like she was witnessing an apse, but this time they weren't tears of terror. They were tears of something I hadn't seen in a very long time. Hope. I just sat there on the floor beside them, my hands still shaking, my body completely drained, but feeling this strange, overwhelming sense of peace. Like nothing else in the entire world mattered right then, except that beautiful, piercing cry, and that mother holding her child for the very first time. The ambulance finally rolled up 20 minutes later. The paramedics loaded Chloe and the baby up to take them to the county hospital for observation. I rode in the back with them. Danny stayed behind to guard the property. At the hospital, the ER docs confirmed what I already knew. The baby was healthy, the mum was stable. Chloe would have to stay in the ward for a few days, but they were both going to be fine. I sat down in the sterile waiting room, my clothes still stained with blood and sweat, and finally let my own tears fall. That's when Jessica walked through the double doors. She had gotten my voicemail and rushed over straight from her office. She sat down next to me and squeezed my shoulder. "I got it," she said quietly. "The state attorney's office is taking the case. The evidence Chloe stashed is a smoking gun. They've launched a formal, top-level investigation." I stared at her, stunned. "What about Clayton?" "Gone. Vanished last night. Nobody has a clue where he is. Abandoned the ranch, his trucks, everything. He ran." My chest tightened. It wasn't the neat cinematic ending I was hoping for. There were no handcuffs, no dramatic perp walk, no righteous justice served right then and there. Just silence, and the lingering dread that he might. "But they'll catch him, right?" I asked. "They will. Might take some time, but they'll get him." 3 months later, Chloe was settled into a little apartment in town, bouncing her baby boy on her knee, working a part-time job, while Jessica aggressively built her case. The investigation was grinding along slowly, the way legal bureaucracy always does, but it was moving forward. Local families actually started getting their deeds back. Buried names were brought back into the light, and Clayton was finally picked up trying to cross the state line into a neighboring jurisdiction. Arrested. Indicted. Sitting in a county jail cell awaiting trial, a long way from his corrupt buddies, totally stripped of the armor he thought made him invincible. Chloe called me every single week, sometimes just to chat, sometimes to ask for mom advice, and sometimes just to say thank you. I always told her she didn't owe me a thing, but she always insisted. And deep down, I knew that weekly phone call was